right, well, we'll get started so we can give Bill his full time. I know there will still be people joining, but like to thank you for being with us today. The forum's being hosted today by the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission. I'm Renee Matson. I'm the executive director, and we have Joe Chapesky with us today, who's our system plan coordinator. This is our first of 4 planned accessibility forums, and they're hosted by Bill Botten, who we are so lucky to have with us today. You've all seen Bill's bio in the newsletter, but I do want to highlight just a few items from his impressive resume. Bill's expertise is absolutely perfect for this audience. He specializes in accessibility issues related to recreation facilities and outdoor developed areas, including recreational boating and fishing facilities, pedestrian trails, and that's the topic of our April 15th forum, picnic and camping facilities, sports facilities, and play areas. Bill served for 22 years as an accessibility specialist, technical assistance coordinator, and the training coordinator at the U.S. Access Board, which is an independent agency that develops and maintains accessibility and guideline standards under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our next forum will be scheduled for April 15th, again from 11:30 until 1, and will focus on accessible pedestrian trails and shared use paths. We don't have anything planned for our third and fourth quarter forums, because we're looking for your feedback on what would be of interest to all of you. So if you want to email Joe or I at any time and let us know what you're interested in having come up in the third and fourth quarters, I've put both of our emails into the chat for you. So send us an email after the forum. Let us know what you're interested in. Joe is also going to be sending out a survey. You can always visit, of course, our website at GMRPTcommission.org. With so many participants today, we're expecting over 50. If you have questions, just put them in the chat and we'll get to those during our last 30 minutes of our session today. Bill has slides to show today, and we're also recording the forum, and those will both be appearing on our website. So if you have colleagues who weren't able to make it here today, send them to our website and you can hear the recording and see the slides. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Bill Botten to us today and take it away.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon for a session on accessible play areas. As Renee said, I was a former federal employee, retired a couple years ago, but really was lucky to be part of a team that developed the accessibility guidelines for the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act for recreation facilities, play areas included, and what we call outdoor developed areas. And since then, I've been working as a consultant, still spreading the good news and hopefully encourage people to provide inclusive facilities. And today's presentation on accessible play areas is one of my favorite in that I really believe that providing an accessible experience for classmates to play at a school park, or in my case, I'm a person that uses a manual wheelchair. I'm the parent of the children that are coming to your play areas, given that opportunity to participate, socialize, play, just enjoy the facilities. And we're going to really only talk about the play area itself, but just understanding and knowing that, there's a lot of supporting features that are really necessary in order to allow a family to participate for the whole day, right? I mean, it would be making sure that you have a site arrival, like an accessible parking area, and thinking about the toilet or bathing facilities that are provided. Are they accessible? Do you have an opportunity to provide maybe an adult changing table? How can we facilitate the opportunity for people to stay longer and enjoy your facilities, especially those recreational parks? I shared with you I'm a person that uses a manual wheelchair as a result of a motor vehicle accident in 1983. So I've used a manual wheelchair now for over 42 years. And finding recreation and finding play was always a real challenge until these requirements came out and established some minimums that Title II entities, state and local governments, as well as persons with disabilities, have this opportunity to participate fully in as many of the recreational opportunities as possible. So today's session, we're going to talk about the coverage of who it applies to. And when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's really additional requirements for surfacing and what we call the use zone that are reference standards, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We got to talk about alterations. We'll clarify the terms that are used, whether they're ground level or elevated play components. We'll talk about the technical provisions of how, once we know how many of what has to be accessible, how are we ensuring that those ground level and elevated play components really facilitate the opportunity to play. So the U.S. Access Board, as Renee was talking earlier, is an independent federal agency that establishes the minimum requirements under several different laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm showing you the Department of Justice's seal and their document. So what happens is the Access Board writes minimum accessibility requirements, and then it's a two-step process to where the Department of Justice has to take that product, those minimum guidelines, send them back out for public comment, take in that additional comment, and then come out with final standards, what we call the Code of Federal Regulation, or in this case, the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. And they are required for all new construction and alterations after the date of March 15th, 2012. So you can see we're coming up on 13 years that these requirements for any new construction or alterations to existing would be covered by the requirements that we're going to talk about today. So what's covered and what's not covered? What's covered are state and local government facilities, city, county, local parks departments, recreation facilities. Their parks, their play areas are required to be accessible, especially, and also places of public accommodation, maybe a privately run daycare or private schools. Maybe you have a restaurant that has a play area as well, or shopping mall. Those would be required under what we call Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But really what we're probably talking about mostly today are those Title II entities, city, state, local, county facilities that incorporate a park. The standards don't cover childcare centers or religious entities. So play areas at a church oftentimes are not covered. And as well as if it's a private residence or there's an HOA issue. If you're at an apartment complex and it's an HOA, typically the Americans with Disabilities Act does not cover those recreation facilities. It would be the Fair Housing Act, and those don't really cover recreation facilities. So there is an option, and it's really, if you do live in an apartment complex, so important that you advocate on behalf of people with disabilities to have access to the swimming pool, access in and out of the pool, access to these play areas in your HOA communities. There is what's called a safe harbor. So a lot of people say, well, my play area is grandfathered in, or it's so old that it doesn't have to meet these. That's just not the reality. Okay, there's what we call a safe harbor, but those are only requirements that you met in the earlier standard. I'll give you an example. So if you have a light switch that's 54 inches side reach off to the side of something, you come into a room, required to be accessible, and the light switch is at 54 inches off the finished floor. That was the requirement in the 1991 standard. In the 2010 ADA standards, it moved everything down to no higher than 48 inches for reach range. So you don't have to alter that 54-inch light switch until you actually go in and do some type of an alteration. You don't have to bring it down. It's not considered a barrier because you met the earlier standard. Okay, even though it's not in compliance with the new standard, you met the earlier standard. That's the only safe harbor there is. I've given you the number at the bottom of the slide for the Department of Justice. That's their technical information line where you can get additional information if you think in some way your facility has a safe harbor. But as I'm going to highlight here, there was not a Chapter 10 in the 1990 version, 91 version of the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility standards. So you don't have a safe harbor. What is required of existing facilities is that they programmatically make sure that that facility is accessible. And whenever you alter something, whatever you touch comes into compliance. And I'll go through some scenarios of that throughout this presentation. So under Title II, and that's the state, local government facilities, the requirement is what we call program access, which means not every single facility might be accessible in your community. Your community might have 5 public play areas outside the school district, in the local parks. Not all of those existing facilities may have to be brought into compliance immediately. But the expectation is over time when you do alter it, then they are, right? But that you have to ensure that that program of a playground opportunity is available to everyone. So how do we do that? We prioritize, right? We identify which ones are as close to being compliant as possible, and then we work to make sure that one is at least accessible and advertise and tell people about that. We've got this accessible play area now in our community. Even though we're working on the others over time, when we remove surface or we remove play elements, that type of thing. Over time, more of them will be accessible, but we've initiated that this program is accessible by at least one of these play areas in our community. And hopefully it's one that's centrally located, serves a large population, meets a lot of the things that you would look for in identifying those priority barriers to remove. Under Title III, and that's the places of public accommodation, like we talked about earlier, maybe a restaurant or a private daycare has a play area. They have the requirement for existing facilities, what's called readily achievable barrier removal. And it basically stands for cheap and easy. That the expectation is over time that you remove barriers. So the first thing you always have to do, remember, on an existing facility is do that audit, right? Go through that existing facility and understand where your barriers are. Because once you have that idea of and that list of where your barriers are, then you can start implementing when you have projects in that area. How can we bring these into compliance over time? Again, the Department of Justice Technical Assistance Information Hotline, they are the enforcing agency. There's been a lot of shakeup in the Department of Justice, and to be honest with you, the Office of Civil Rights isn't pursuing a lot. But if you ever did get an accessibility inquiry about one of your facilities, say a person with a disability is claiming that their civil rights have been violated, because that's what it requires under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You have to say that my civil rights as a young person or a parent with a disability is unable to access this program to these facilities. And you would send that complaint to the Department of Justice, the enforcing agency. And typically what's happening right now is that they send a letter back and they ask you if these allegations are true. And if you have some kind of transition plan to remediate these barriers over time. And if you have an answer to that, okay, you have an answer that, yes, we've identified our barriers in our play areas. Yes, we're working to make this program accessible. That's all the farther it's going to go. That is all the farther it's going to go. So the most important thing is to have a plan, understand where your barriers are, and how you're going to remove them over time. I want to briefly just tell you that there is another accessibility law that requires play areas to be accessible. And that is what we call the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards. And it applies to all federal sites. It could apply to your site if you receive federal funding. But the good news is that the requirements for a play area on a federal park or at a General Services Administration's daycare on federal land or receive federal funding, the requirements for play areas under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act are identical. There's very few differences between the requirements for federal facilities and state and local government and private facilities. Typically, it involves vertical access when an elevator is involved in certain buildings. Remember, state and federal and city facilities have to have an elevator even if they're only 2 stories. Where a commercial facility or places of public accommodation under Title III could go to 3 stories. And so that's really one of the only differences. And why that's so important is that persons with disabilities like myself, that if I went into a bathroom on a federal, Park Service or Forest Service toilet room, and then went into my city or county local toilet room, or I went into the McDonald's on my way home or used the bathroom at the hotel I'm staying at, the idea that those minimum requirements are the same throughout all those facilities, okay, helps people with disabilities understand, if I can't do that independently, which is the goal, right? That's our goal of providing access, is making sure people of all ages, all abilities have as much independent access as possible. And so if I can't do that independently, I know I need help everywhere I go. And that's an important feature with the standards. And really what the Access Board worked on was to make sure that we consolidated those requirements, easier for designers, easier for people with disabilities to understand that the requirements are across the board now. So the play area standards also don't apply to play areas that are designed for kids under 2, those really small ones. If your family has a child care facility at your home and you live there, and amusement attractions are not considered a play area. I told you earlier on that if you have the 2010 ADA standards, you don't have the whole book. Because what it does is it references other things, like for platform lifts, for elevators, for fire alarms, and for playground surfacing. So not knowing all the technical requirements for play surfacing or have the expertise, standard setting agencies rely on other organizations like the National Fire Protection Agency, the International Building Code. They rely on other voluntary standard organizations to develop standards for specific issues like elevators, platform lifts, fire alarms, playground surfacing. When you talk about playground surfacing, it's ASTM International. And ASTM International has 3 different reference standards that apply in play areas. The first one, 1487, defines what we call the use zone. And I'll talk more about that in a second. 1292 requires you to have fall attenuating surface. If somebody takes a header from 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, 14 feet, you need a surface that protects at all those different levels, okay? That reduces the level of injury. So there's a test where they drop a head form, and I'll show you that more of that in a minute, where they drop a head form and they take an evaluation of your surface material. If your surface material is freezing, it's probably not being very fall attenuating. You really need to consider that the surface that you're putting in is something that is over time is going to facilitate access through your environmental cycle, right? And if you're going to do a unitary rubber surface, you need to know exactly how long that's going to last. You need to test it throughout its lifeline, its life cycle, to make sure that kids are not in danger. Typically, when I've seen litigation on play areas, it's because somebody got hurt first, and then they look at the accessibility as well. Okay, but typically it's the lawyers for those that got hurt are coming out to see if your surface is compliant. That's typically how it works. ASTM F1951 is the wheelchair workability requirement. So it basically talks about how hard it is to push through a surface like engineered wood fiber, push through rubber tiles, push through a turf surface. So you have these competing factors, right? You have this requirement for you to provide accessible routes so somebody in a wheelchair can get there, but also that it's soft enough so that when somebody falls, you're preventing as many injuries as possible. I told you that 1487 is that use zone requirement. Based on the height somebody would fall, there's a circumference or a diameter all the way around that play component that establishes where that surface has to be fall attenuating. So typically when you're way out by the sidewalk and you're just coming in the play area, that surface needs to still be accessible oftentimes, but it doesn't need to be fall attenuating because you don't have a piece of play equipment that somebody would fall from. 1292, and I'm showing you here a picture of what they call the triax, and it drops a head form from the highest height somebody could jump from. And typically that's going to be the roof or the top rail, and because kids are going to climb as high as they can get, and if they fall from that height, that surface needs to protect them from that level. So that's how that's determined. And the values can't exceed a 200 G max, which is how fast it comes down, and then what they call a head impact criteria of less than 1,000. Now, when you're in a motor vehicle, the HIC is only 700. I fought for years to try to get that 1,000 lower to provide surfaces that were more accessible, but it hasn't come through as a standard. So there's areas like even riding in a vehicle that the HIC is lower, and on sports fields it's lower than in play areas, but play areas still allow a very high, in my opinion, head impact value. So here's the wheelchair workability requirements, and I show you on the bottom picture that somebody's pushing up a 7% grade. It measures the amount of work somebody's using to push those wheels to go up, and then what it does is take that playground surface and install it in a test bed, and you go for 4 pushes on a 90-degree turn and in a straight line. And as long as that surface doesn't require more force than it did to go up that 7% grade, your surface is good to go. There is not a field test right now for this. That's what I've been working on for more than 20 years, and still I'm a chairperson of a committee in what we call the Rehabilitation Engineering Science of North America, RESNA, where we're hoping to be able to evaluate all kinds of surfaces, trail surface, play area surfaces, for firmness and stability, because that's the requirement for accessible routes. But right now, this is the requirement for wheelchair workability. In alterations, it's very different than maintenance. And I strongly urge you that if you're doing some type of work in a play area and you have questions about whether or not it's an alteration or is it just maintenance, because they're very different, right? I mean, if you're just replacing in kind, like I'm showing you here, you've got an S-hook that they've worn out because it's gone back and forth too many times. That's just maintenance of existing features, right? It's similar to if the grab bar falls off the toilet room wall, you got to go back and put it on. That you can't just leave it off. This is a safety issue, but also a maintenance issue. But if you're doing something where we consider it affecting usability, and that's the real key. Does it affect usability? Like changing the surface material affects usability because it's scoped. So understanding the difference between, is this normal maintenance? Am I replacing it to just like it was? I'm just making sure it's safe. It's not going to hurt anybody. Or am I actually changing the usability of something, changing a different play component? Alterations that could affect or do affect the usability of a play area is considered an alteration. So examples could include like removing a climbing or play component and replacing it with a spring rocker or some other type of play component, or changing that ground surface would affect usability and is considered an alteration. When you do an alteration to what we call a primary function area, and I'm on slide number 18, if you do an alteration to a primary function area, there's this additional obligation. And it doesn't only apply to recreation facilities, it applies, say, if you had a building and you altered a classroom, or you altered the main reason somebody comes to it, a visitor center lobby. If you alter a primary function area, there's an expectation that you provide what's called a path of travel obligation. And that is that we don't have just these pockets of altered primary function areas, in this case, a play area, that there's an expectation that now you try to get people to that altered primary function area. So it's 20% disproportionality is the rule set by the Department of Justice. The expectation is that when you alter, you remove the play surface and do a new play surface, you've now altered a primary function area. And in that alteration, you now have an additional obligation to get somebody to that altered primary function area, up to 20% of the total cost of that alteration. More of that information can be found at the Department of Justice website, and I'll give you that when we're done. But it's so important to think about that, whether you're altering this primary function area, there is an obligation to make sure somebody has maybe a parking space to park at, an accessible parking space. Maybe it's an on-street space. Maybe it's a passenger loading zone at a school. But then the accessible route, that route that connects from that site arrival point, maybe through the park to the playground, now has a requirement that you spend up to 20% of that alteration cost. There is an opportunity to use small projects over a series of multiple years, combine that money to come up with that overall cost of what the alteration to a path of travel might be. So when we talk about path of travel, we're talking about altering a primary function area. We're not talking about the way that somebody goes. We're talking about that requirement for additional money to be spent towards the accessible route of getting people to that altered primary function area. I'm going to clarify some terms is the next idea, because we're going to move in now. We really went through some application issues, right? We talked about when it's required, what law requires it, and then when you have an opportunity to do on existing facilities, alterations or maintenance. So clarifying some of the terms of the application of the play area standard, they have to define what a play area is. It contains play components, designed and constructed for children. It's really designed and constructed for children and adult, I think it should have said. I'm showing you a play area here that has a turf and an engineered wood fiber surface. And the reason they did the turf was because they didn't want to maintain the engineered wood fiber for accessibility requirements. Okay. So what they've done is they've linked all the requirements for accessibility either to a hard surface where the ramp meets, or they put turf underneath it so that it's at the discharge of a slide or at the entrance to a composite play structure, or it gets you the swings that are required to be accessible. I don't like to see this. Imagine the trip hazard that causes between surface material types. And my kids always knew how long my arm was. Okay. They'd be at the edge of that turf exactly that length way when it was time to go home. Okay. Or they did something wrong, or I wanted to come here, or anything else. That's what they knew how long my arm was. Access to the full play area is how we make them inclusive. That's how we ensure that everybody has the same opportunity to run, play tag, and do everything, and not stay on the hard surface, right? Not stay on the areas that are defined to be accessible, but the whole area. So there's requirements for outside the play area, and I'm showing you a route that's coming over to a play area. And then there's that boundary that once you get inside the play area, accessible route requirements change. Just one example is outside that play area, you can have a 36-inch route for up to 200 feet before you have to go to 5 feet just so somebody could pass. But it could be only 36 inches wide all the way to the play area. But once you get to the play area, now you have a 60-inch route or 5-foot wide route throughout the play area, connecting those elements required to be accessible. I think the important thing to understand is, remember, you have to connect elements and spaces on the same site with at least one accessible route. That's the real trigger. All elements and spaces on the site have to be connected by at least one accessible route. Here I'm showing you they have a hard surface that went all the way behind this play area, but they've got this other route comes up to it. I drew that white line to kind of emphasize that now we're going into the play area and the requirements are different. That's not a curb. But the idea here is that you only need one route to a play area, but that one route needs to be accessible. Okay, you could have another route that has stairs. You could have another route that is a steep slope, but you're going to have one route that gets somebody with a disability on an accessible route, and hopefully the common circulation path. That's a really key thing, right? Don't send the person with a disability around to the backside when everybody else just comes to the front, right? So the idea that the whole family goes together. So the real route to this play area, right, is showing here as the families walking together. That's the common circulation path. Should also be the accessible route. A couple other application issues is that a play area is not an area of sport activity. An area of sport activity is a ball field, could be a horseshoe pit, could be a bocce ball, could be a skate park, could be a tennis court, could be a racquetball court. Okay, that's the portion of the room or space where play or practice of sports occurs. Okay, you might think you're doing a sport in a play area, but typically it's just play. The idea here is we have a play environment and we have a sports environment, and the requirements for each of them is very different. If you separate your play areas geographically, one side of the building to the other, you're required to make sure that both of those comply in new construction and whatever you alter. So what's a play component? It's designed to generate that opportunity for play and socialization and learning. Now, a lot of manufacturers will start saying, I have upper body climbing, I have lower body climbing, I have a bumpy slide, I have a circular slide, I have a wavy slide. And they'll try to type a whole bunch of different things, okay? Really look at the expectation here. The standard talks about sliding, swinging, climbing. It really breaks it down to, when we talk about one of each type being accessible, that you break it down to the real form of what's happening there. Sliding, swinging, rocking. Here you see one on the left where they're digging. The idea would be is that one of each type is going to be accessible at minimum. When we talk about nature play components, falling a tree, putting a bunch of rocks, making a grass mound, something like that, a turf mound. There's a big emphasis to make urban parks more rural, right? To make them like you climbing on a tree. The expectation here is you still get to it, you still get through it. One of each type is still going to have to be somewhat accessible to get to it. So the surfacing material would be the key factor. If you're creating mounds and you're putting things on top of mounds, it's going to be considered a composite play structure. Okay. Once you create a composite play structure, now you're required to either provide transfer or ramp access to the top. If it's just a mound, you could get somebody off at the bottom and they scoot and climb and roll or whatever on the mound. But if you provide a whole bunch of elevated play components on top of your mound, now you're going to need either a transfer system or a ramp to get somebody up to it. What's not a play component? The transfer system, the steps, the decks, ladders, roofs. Your kids might be on the roof, but that's not considered a play component. Okay. So ground level play components is approached and exited at ground level. I'm showing you some ideas here. This thing you're spinning in makes you sick. The swing over on the left-hand side, or just this, what is a whale coming out of the sand there. Those would be considered ground level because you get on it and off it at ground level. An elevated play component is one that's approached from an elevated level. Now, there's a lot of things where they say they're functionally linked. Okay, I have these things that are functionally linked to a composite play structure. Maybe it's a series of stepping pods that comes off, or it's something else like a track rider that you shoot across from a large composite play structure. Whenever you start talking about functionally linked, really look to see if the only way really on or off that thing is at ground level. But I'm showing you some here where it's a block climber on the lower left, where it reaches an upper level and you could get off of it. It's only counted once. That would always be elevated. I'm showing you where a person's in a wheelchair at a upper level like play component panel. coming out of their wheelchair, all of those would be considered elevated because they're on an elevated level. If you have a slide coming off of an elevated level, unless it's standalone, it's always considered elevated. It's important to understand the differences because the standards require different percentages or numbers of ground level plate components and elevated plate components to be accessible. And when you go into and evaluate an accessible play area, you're going to have to go in there and say, well, which ones are my accessible ones? Okay, these are the ones I have to have a route to because elements and spaces on the same side have to be connected. So I have to be able to have a 60-inch route connecting to that spring rocker, to one of the swings, to you. So when you understand which ones are accessible, you can understand what routes need to be accessible as well. Just to go back one more time, you see the one on the left is going to be always ground level. You're often on it only at ground level. The ring climber on the right is just that. It's an elevated plate component because it can be reached from an elevated level. Only counted once, always counted as elevated. Right? So ground level scoping provisions is the requirement of how many of what, and at ground level, it's a requirement of one of each type. Here I'm showing you sand around a play area at a beach I took where I've circled 2 swings that are underneath this rubber mat. That rubber mat was a series of tiles. They provide an accessible route all the way to those swings only. A sand digger on the one where I've circled below where they've created a concrete area where somebody in a mobility device could not sit out in the middle, but sit on that hard surface and still use those elements to create that backhoe idea. And then here's a talk tube or some type of a panel on the left. So it would require one of each type of the type of components you have at ground level, whether that be rocking or swinging or whatever the element might be. One of each type must be accessible. Let me back up and just briefly say that, we're talking minimum requirements. I'm hoping you do way better than this, right? We want way better than one. Here I'm showing you even with those sand diggers and the swings that they're incorporating a couple of them, providing not just a strap swing, but an adaptive swing seat, facilitates greater access to some people. But I'm hoping that you go beyond the minimums. I often say in my training sessions that if you're only doing the minimums, it's a D, okay? You pass, just barely, you pass. You did nothing special. Right? We didn't incorporate to make sure that everybody still gets to participate. Maybe somebody that can't hear, see, walk. Maybe you have somebody that is on the autism spectrum that needs a quiet, shaded area. How are we facilitating that access? How are we protecting them from maybe their elopement where they want to run and protecting them with some type of landscaping or fencing? What are we doing to make sure that we're inclusive to everybody throughout the whole facility? So hopefully way beyond the minimum, but that one must be integrated into the play area so that everybody has an opportunity to play together. There is a requirement that if you start doing just a whole bunch of elevated play components, it triggers more ground level. And so there is a scoping requirement. It says based on the number of elevated play components you provide, there's also an additional requirement to make sure you've got enough at ground level. So if we just looked at one example, the 11 to 13, say I had 11 to 13 elevated play components. The middle column says minimum number of ground level plate components to be on an accessible route was 4. And then it says on the last column, it says the minimum number of different types of ground level plate components required to be on that accessible route is 3. So there you can see you might have 2 of the same and then 2 of other ground level based on how many elevated plate components you put in your play area. Okay. So it's just a trigger to say that somebody that may not be able to leave their mobility device has opportunities at ground level and not everything's at an elevated level. Some of the technical provisions are providing a vertical clearance to ground level plate components. This can be challenging if you're doing playhouses, things where you've got a duct to get into, but at least to the door or to the entrance has to be an 80-inch vertical clearance at ground level. It also requires what I'm showing you here, what we call clear floor ground spaces. So at the elements or plate components that you're going to say are accessible, you would need a wheelchair parking space in that same accessible surface. So you got there on a 60-inch route. Now I've got this accessible surface underneath or around that piece of equipment to make sure that somebody with a mobility device can access onto it. The ground level accessible route requirements incorporate all of these different technical requirements. The type of surface it is, how wide it is. I told you 60 inches. There is the ability to reduce that down. Changes in level are no greater than a ½ inch. When I'm talking change in level, I'm talking a vertical change. So when you come off of a sidewalk, and I'm showing you here onto a unitary rubber surface, When you leave that sidewalk and go into that play area where that accessible route meets, it can have no greater than a half-inch vertical change in level. That is hard to maintain when you're doing a loose fill product, right? I mean, the kids are kicking it, throwing it, eating it. It's coming home. It's in your dryer. It's everywhere, right? That stuff is hard to maintain if you have a lot of kids on it. Imagine several hundred kids coming out multiple times a day at recess. How do we ever maintain that loose fill product? So understanding the type of surface you have and the people that are using it and how to make sure you have access to it the best is some of the things that we're going to talk about. The requirement for running slope, cross slope, openings, and also there's a requirement for protruding objects where we just talked about a 80-inch vertical clearance. So we're asking for a 60-inch minimum clear route that allows two persons in mobility devices to be able to pass. There is in smaller play areas the requirement that you can reduce from 60 inches down to 44 based on the size of your play area to limit the size of those accessible routes. And you could even narrow it down to 36 inches for a distance of 5 feet if you had to get around a tree or something else. So there is the permission to even narrow it down to 36 inches, similar to an accessible route outside the play area, for just a distance of 5 feet. In a play area, it says that you can have 1 in 16 running slope or a 6% grade at ground level. Still be considered accessible. Okay, so you can have up to a 6% running slope. The cross slope is always 2%. So here's the challenge. You have a cross slope at 2% and a running slope no greater than 6%. Okay, but how do you do that and make sure that you can run in all different directions, right? How do you do it so that you can make sure your clear floor spaces, your turning spaces, access to one of each type along the accessible routes are all no greater than a 2% cross slope and a 6% running slope? Well, you need to know where your ground level play components are, right? And where your entry and exit points are for your elevated play components to identify those places that have to meet those requirements and how would somebody get to them. Typically, the best way to do it is to ensure that the play area is no greater than 2% in all directions all the time. So that can be very challenging for a contractor pouring, a unitary rubber surface or somebody doing the underlayment of a turf surface that's going to come into your play area. That can be very challenging to ensure that there's no greater than 2%. But what you do have to ensure is that along those accessible routes, it is no greater than 2% running cross slope. Openings no greater than a half inch. I'm just showing you on the left-hand side where two sidewalks weren't butted against each other. If you're going to run into a play area from a concrete, never hard stop it. Run it into the play area, especially if it's going to be a loose fill product. So here's that change in level requirement, a 1/4 inch vertical maximum, half inch if the top edge is beveled 1 to 2. And I'm showing you a ramp coming in from a sidewalk on the left-hand side into engineered wood fiber. That's what you want to do. You want to slope it down into it and never hard end it because then you're going to have that surface change of greater than a half inch, right? So always make sure that you keep running that into 0 and then let your loose fill migrate up onto it. Carpet, there is a requirement for accessible routes to have no greater than a half inch pile. This has been a real challenge for the turf industry because the turf industry is saying that they can do a 1.5 or 2 inch pile and infill it up to that half inch and still be compliant. I'm a person who uses a manual wheelchair. I understand how hard it is to push. I understand how hard it is to push on a shag carpet with a big pad. And that's what you're asking people to do right there. A shag carpet with a thick pad. If you're infilling it. It'll be interesting to see. The Department of Justice, the enforcing agencies have not come down on any of this yet. If you're going to do turf and you're not, and you're providing wheelchair access. Now, if you did a mound and it was just a mound, you can have whatever height pile on that you want because now it's a play component. You're not going to provide wheelchair access, remember, unless you have a whole bunch of stuff up there. But if it's just a mound, you can do turf whatever height you want. But if it's on that accessible route, connecting those elements and spaces that are required, those play components at ground level and entry and exit points at elevated, you want to make sure that somebody can actually use that stuff. And by infilling with coconut husk or loose rubber, or, I mean, we've all got that at the house too, right? From somebody playing on a sports field. You got that rubber crumb in your dryer, in your wash machine, in your car, in your shoes. It's the same thing here. They're infilling the loose rubber with that turf. And so I think it makes it a lot more challenging. I think about a young person trying to push a manual chair in that. The only thing that's good about it is it prevents injury and it's a unitary surface when it's done right, that it's easier to roll on, not not the amount of force, but there's no change in level. There's no irregularities that make it tough. It's all a unitary type surface. So just be careful when you're doing turf. I would require the thinnest, the shortest pile possible with the least amount of infill that you can still reach those fall height head impact tests. I already told you it's an 80-inch minimum vertical height requirement on an accessible route at ground level. So here we go into play surfacing. There's a lot of different types. The National Center on Accessibility, now it's called the Epley Center. It's at Indiana University. Did a 7-year study with the Access Board, and I was the staff person that helped run that. But here we're just showing where we were testing, but we tested surfaces over a 7-year period in engineered wood fiber, which is a wood fiber hammer milled wood chip. We did rubber tiles. We did a turf. We did a unitary surface. The loose rubber people would not participate. They didn't want to participate because it can't make it accessible. And so if you're doing a loose rubber, I really challenge you to see if you can make it accessible. I don't think you can. Out of that study came a document that's available at the U.S. Access Board's website under research, and it's called The 7 Things Every Playground Owner Should Know About the Accessibility of Their Playground Surface. Here's what I got to tell you. Don't just buy it and walk away. Make sure whoever sells that stuff to you gives you a warranty, test it upon installation. You know how long it's going to last. Test it throughout the life cycle of that product so you make sure everybody's safe. If you're freezing solid out there, it's not safe for kids to be on, right? Somehow you need to make that aware in your websites or on information to let people know that it might not be fall attenuating when the temperature's over this and it has been for a certain period of time, right? I mean, give people warning about that kind of thing. So understand your playground surface, test it, okay? My next slide shows you that there is going to be a field test soon for the 1951. On the right side, it's called a rotational penetrometer. They're now changing it to instrumented surface indenter, ISI. And the one on the left is the triax, where I showed you how they drop it at the same height as your playground equipment and try to determine that head impact value. Buy the surface, get a warranty, understand how long it's going to last, test upon installation through the life cycle of the product, and know when you have to budget for another whole new surface. It can be 2/3 of the cost of your play area. It could limit what you have in your play area just because the surface costs so much. Okay, that's why people do engineered wood fiber. It's the cheapest alternative. If you're going to do engineered wood fiber, you need to continually compact that, especially when it's wet. Compact it when it's wet. Put 2 inches more of it in there, wet that, compact it again to bring it up to the level that you need to. The only way it's going to be accessible is if you vibrotamp and compact that surface on a regular basis. Elevated play components, it requires 50% of them. Remember at ground level, I told you it was one of each type. Elevated, it's 50% of the elevated components have to be on an accessible route. And that accessible route is permitted to be a series of steps in a transfer platform if you're under 20 elevated play components. That's why you'll find a whole bunch of these that have 19. Okay, they'll have 19 so they can provide transfer and they don't have to do a ramp. Because once you hit that 20 or more, now you have to provide a ramp to at least 25% of the 50% required to be accessible. So only a few. I advocate that more ramps should be used. If you provide more ramp access, you don't have to do additional ground level in that chart I showed you earlier. Okay, but if you're under 20 elevated play components total, the requirement is you can use the transfer system, and that is a transfer platform and a series of transfer steps, and that can be really challenging. Imagine a whole lot of kids running around on that play surface, that deck all over everywhere, and you're scooting or crawling, okay? Or the surface is dark color like this and it's been out in the sun all afternoon. So it can be really challenging to be somebody that's crawling or scooting when everybody else is running. So providing ramp access to 50% of the play components doesn't require any additional at ground level. Earlier, that chart I showed you was based on a whole bunch of elevated, nothing at ground. Now you got to do more at ground level. If you can ramp 50% of your elevated play components all the time, there's no requirement to do anything at ground additional. That elevated accessible route's 36 inches wide. Exceed it whenever possible. I mean, you want 2 people to be able to pass like what I'm showing you here. That requires 60 inches or 5 feet. There is a requirement that you can reduce it down to 32 inches, similar to going through a door. There is, anytime you have wheelchair access, there's still that opening requirement. You got to look at the punched holes in that surface material, no greater than 1 inch. If they're elongated openings, then they're perpendicular to the direction of travel. So whenever you ramp to an elevated play component, the maximum you can go up is 12 inches. Okay, so you can have a maximum running slope of 1 in 12, but you can only go up 1 foot. Whereas in the built environment, a ramp into the front of a building, you have 30 inches of vertical rise before you have to have a landing. In a play area, you can only go 12 inches of vertical rise before you have to have a landing. Okay, so only 12 inches of vertical rise. That's why you see a lot of this being done. Okay, they want to get you to a higher height to get you a good slide, or to get you a pole slide, or get you something, right? So that they want to be able to get you up higher, and each ramp run can only be 12 inches of vertical rise. So how do we do that? We start with a berm, right? We sink the play area. That's how they try to get you up higher. There is a requirement for handrails on those ramps whenever you do ramp, but there is not a requirement for 2 handrails. Okay, now you can say the top of the guard is your upper handrail. You can use that, but the only thing in a play area is required is a lower handrail. And that lower handrail is between 20 and 28 inches. Okay, 1.5 inches away from the side surface. It does require edge protection. Whenever you have a handrail, you have to have an edge protection. You can either extend the deck by 12 inches or have a vertical, make it so a vertical sphere less than 4 inches doesn't pass through. I'm showing you a horizontal pipe here on the right-hand side of slide 59. There's several ways to do edge protection. That bar could be all the way against the surface. It could be no higher than 4 inches. You can extend the depth up to 12 inches, or you could have vertical pickets all the way to the ground surface that still does not allow a 4-inch sphere to go through. I told you that after every 12 inches of vertical rise or a 12-foot ramp, you'd have to have a level landing. If it changes direction, it's 5 by 5. If it doesn't change direction, it's 5 foot in the direction of travel. And again, 36 inches minimum width. Here I'm showing you an elevated steering wheel here. The young ladies at a clear floor space or wheelchair parking space, and that wheelchair parking space can obstruct the route and the turning circle when one person's there. So you can see how confined it could be if there's one person on an elevated structure in a wheelchair, and here I'm showing you a small wheelchair, how that can obstruct the rest of opportunity to play. So the more space up there, putting elements where play is going to occur in a landing area that's out of the way of traffic is always something to consider. Here I'm showing you a first transfer system picture. It includes a transfer platform. That's that first place you see. It's a 24 by 14 minimum. It includes transfer steps, transfer supports, and that wheelchair parking space right adjacent to it. I already told you that less than 20 elevated play components can use that transfer access to get to those 50% of elevated play components. So it could consist of that platform and stairs. Here I'm just showing you a couple different ways of doing it for somebody to crawl or bump up. This is really challenging. I got to admit, I can't do it. I'm old. But scooting around on that hard surface, I mean, if you're in shorts or something and that surface is hot, or there's an opportunity that you could have skin breakdown, things like that can really limit the ability, and whether or not you have the arm strength to be able to do this can really limit your ability to interact with any of that play opportunity. And that's what it's really about, right? Is trying to provide that independent access to best as possible. So your transfer platform could be odd shaped. Here I'm showing you, I just typically bring a piece of cardboard for things like that, 14 by 24, lay it on it, show that it's clear, you can jump onto it. It's at least 11 to 18 inches above the surface, and that 24-inch side is unobstructed, and there's somewhat to grab onto. It seems like the transfer supports anymore are holes in the platform, a wide, long, oblong hole. Those are permitted. It doesn't say what that transfer support has to be, but anytime that you can get an arm at an elevated level to give you additional leverage, it is easier to transfer. And so here I'm showing you a couple different ways that people would use a bar that's not obstructing the way to get on, but still could be used for transfer. Again, just the minimum size requirements. Each stair can be up to 8 inches. 8 inches is huge for a little kid to transfer up while they're scooting. I suggest way less than that. Transfer supports, it just says a means to get on. I'm showing just a couple different ways. Remember that the motion is going to be downward. If you have a vertical pole, the only way to use it's on the top, like I'm showing you. So many times people will put a vertical pole there and say it's my transfer support, and it's too tall to use as a vertical support. What are you going to do? Grab a hold of it and use it? It's just too difficult to do. So realistically, look how you're doing that. Again, 11 to 18 is where the transfer platform is off the surface. The limiting the distance between the slide and the transfer platform. Okay, I've crawled all the way up there. I've come down the slide. Now I got to go back over the transfer platform to get back up, right? So limiting the distance there can really enable someone to get back to a mobility device or crawl to that other surface material. Here again, I'm showing you a rubber overlay that they're doing over an engineered wood fiber surface, and they've only included that in the areas that they've had to be required to be accessible. Plate components can be used as an elevated accessible route. So I'm showing you a crawl tube on the left. You could crawl to that area, and then that crawl tube would be considered a plate component as well as part of your accessible route. Accessible plate components have a clear floor or ground space, that wheelchair parking space. They have an entry point or a seat, and there are plate tables, and there's advisory reach ranges. Integration into the play area is the big thing, right? How do we make sure that they're not separated? When I've showed you all those different surface materials, it's really being separated, right? We want everybody to be integrated as best as possible. That minimum clear space, a wheelchair parking space, is just like it is at a drinking fountain. It is at a sink. It's, everywhere. It's 30 by 48 inches minimum. That's the minimum size. Mobility devices are getting bigger. People lay back farther, or people have their feet out farther. Those minimums, 30 by 48, are being increased by model building codes. So you may be in an area where your model building code has increased that clear floor space to more like 54 by, I think it's 36. Here I'm showing you some ground level plate components that just have an entry point or a seat. Here they say you can transfer up to 24 inches of vertical height for a young kid. I think it's too high. I think really you should be going somewhere no higher than 18 inches to get onto a plate component at ground level. I threw this in because I didn't know if you had any splash parks, but the water park requirements are exempted for the accessible routes, but you still have requirements if you're putting plate components just with a water surface. You need to meet the play area requirements. So there's lots of resources that can help you besides this webinar or seminar. The Access Board has, as I showed you, a play area surface. 7 things every playground owner should know about their playground surface. They also have a technical assistance guide, a guide to accessibility guidelines for the play areas. They also have a frequently asked questions, and if you're altering an existing play area, go to the FAQs at the end, and I've shown you here how you get on the website, how you get to that. They also have that completed research where we did a lot of work with engineered wood fiber, or we tested a lot of different surfaces to see how long they would last. Let me tell you this, the installation cost of engineered wood fiber is the cheapest, okay? And over the life cycle, you're going to have the greater maintenance cost, right? You're going to be out there sometimes daily trying to rake the hole under the swing or slide again. So it may be the cheapest to install, but it might be the most expensive to maintain. Where the surfaces that are unitary, like the turfs or the unitary rubbers, they're more expensive to install, but they're cheaper to maintain, right? So you really need to pick your poison. Do you have maintenance staff that can really enable you to do a cheap install, but a high maintenance cost? I wanted to throw this in there because I said one of the main things you really want to do is be able to evaluate that existing play area. Understand what you got. Where are your barriers? That's the key thing. Well, the ADA National Network has resources in every region around the country, at least, till August. We'll see if funding keeps going. A lot of these programs through the Department of Education, in this case, NIDLR, they're really seriously being looked at being cut out. And this regional network of ADA centers around the country has been funded now for almost 30 years, but it's looking like it might go away. Right now, there is recreation facility checklists. So if you're trying to do a checklist on a play area, I've given you the website where you can at least go get one you can download or look at it, print off, maybe have Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or some community group go out and do the volunteer and check them off for you. There's also toilet rooms. There's also fishing facilities and boating facilities. There's all the other recreation requirements, but I think it's important to understand that unless you're going to hire somebody that really knows those minimum requirements, there is not a good checklist out there. And these are okay, they just don't bring you all the way. Okay. Just understand that this is going to get you quite a ways there and would allow you to get that first look at your play area. And it might be something that you can, like you say, have your staff do if they're already out there anyway, to evaluate your existing facilities. But I wanted to say that if you call that 800 number here on this slide, you will get your region, and your region comes out of Chicago. Great bunch of folks there. The Great Lakes ADA Center, Region 5, a bunch of great people up there. They would be the resource that when you called them or sent them an email, they would be the ones responding. So they are local. Hopefully they can have some local resources for you too. Well, it's time for your questions. I say that concludes my verbal portion of the play area equipment presentation. Now I'd like to begin that slideshow. So I'm hoping that Renee and Joe have been watching and got a stack of questions for me, because I rattled off that stuff so fast. I was like a used car salesman. And I'm hoping that I didn't leave you in the dust, and that if you have questions, you make sure we get them answered before we all leave today.
Thanks, Bill. People keep putting questions in the chat. The first one is about equipment, and is relocating equipment to another location considered an alteration or maintenance, putting it back as it was versus a new layout?
Yeah, typically what's going to happen there is you're moving something to a new location. If it goes outside the use zone of where it was, they say it's a new installation. So that component would need to comply. And if you look at the frequently asked questions in that play area section, that FAQ, they go into a lot of different scenarios of replacing the surface or replacing a play component. Typically, it's if you moved it outside the use zone, created a new use zone, it's going to trigger the surface to be, well, you're going to have to probably redo the surface somewhere unless it's just engineered wood fiber. And then you would do, again, a new compaction, new installation of that surface material. But that if you moved it outside its current use zone, then yes, it would be considered that the play component would now need to be considered accessible. And remember that that's not a lot. That's an entry point or a seat typically at the right height if it's like a spring rocker or swing or something like that. But if it's a climbing element, it would just be a new route to it.
Second question is more of a statement, and maybe we need to get some clarity, but it's that Minnesota has more accessibility requirements than ADA.
Okay.
Parking, signage, aisle, widths of exterior accessible routes, toilet room maneuvering spaces. So I don't know if that was more of a statement or simply a talking point.
It is a talking point. And that is the truth. We talked about that these federal requirements are a minimum, and that your state code could increase a lot of different things. They can't fall below the federal requirement, but they can definitely exceed them. And like you just heard Renee talk about, the number of accessible parking has been increased. The size of the access aisles, the van space for more of them has been increased. The turning space inside a toilet room has been increased. So it is important to always consult your state, your local codes, in addition to the requirements for federal, because I'll be honest with you, these trainings over the next few years are going to have to be about your state code, not about the federal requirements, because the feds is not keeping up with what the states are doing. They're exceeding the minimums. And in order to ensure that you're compliant with your local code inspector, you need to ensure that you understand the differences between the state code and the federal minimums. Very important. Very important, though.
The next one is design concept of entry to several separate events on top of a hill. What about the concern of safety of transferring onto the equipment or wheelchairs rolling down the hill at a distance of 15 or 25 feet or more?
Yeah, there's not really an edge protection requirement. So if you've ramped to the top of a mound, and then you have play components up on top of that mound, there is not a requirement for edge protection, because the idea here is kids are going to just run off the edge or roll or somersault or whatever you want. And I can understand that there is some, but remember, so many times you have a ramp on an exterior of a building that comes up right next to a series of stairs, right? Nobody's running down them stairs, right? So I think there's risk, and it should be maybe some level of care, but I would hate to see that you would want to put up any type of a railing or curb because you think it's too dangerous for somebody in a mobility device up on that hill. it is a challenge, right? I mean, you can be out in an outdoor environment and it's not as stable, but you can be in the built environment with a 6-inch, 8-inch drop off immediately to the side of you at a curb. And that's going to flop you onto your side. And again, you could run across perpendicular to the top edge of a stair that could be very big stairs with no edge protection or requirement to limit a person's ability to move or be a safety issue. And the standards that we're talking about are not safety standards other than those surface requirements. They are accessibility. And I would hope that you would maybe get consumer input if you feel it's too dangerous, because I really believe that that's a true thing about how you make sure that your play area is inclusive, right? It's you get a population of people, parents, young people. The local playground that I have in my community here outside of Washington, D.C., they had a challenge where kids from all the elementary schools were chosen to be part of a committee at City Hall and got to talk about it. And persons with disabilities and parents all got to choose the type of equipment and surface and work to, develop a play area that really facilitated what I like to think of as all ages, all abilities, all the time. So that we're incorporating the greatest opportunity for people to participate. And so I think that really always speaks to having a large pool of people provide input on the design construction.
Great. This one is, what are the implications for outdoor fitness equipment? Would the minimum requirement just be to have one of them accessible? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, not play areas, but yes, there is requirements in Chapter 10 on exercise equipment machines. There's no requirement to change the machine itself. There is a requirement to get one of each type. And so oftentimes we see these on a park course, right? We see them around a lake, or you have all these stations along typically is a shared use path. And as Renee said, we're going to go into in April, the differences between, do I have a pedestrian trail or do I have a shared use path, or what do I have? But remember, when you're connecting elements and spaces on the same site, we have an accessible route. Now, you can call this happy trails around to each piece of exercise equipment, but it ain't a trail. Not per the accessibility requirements. You're connecting elements and spaces on the same site required to be accessible. It's an accessible route. Okay. Now, there are differences between those routes. Slope, the requirement, anything over 5% on an accessible route has to have handrails. Okay. So that can be really challenging in a park setting. So understand the type of route you have, and that if you're connecting from your site arrival to one of each type of piece of these equipment, somehow one route has to be a minimum of 36 inches wide, a running slope no greater than 5%, a cross slope of no greater than 2%, to one of each type, and then a wheelchair parking space by one of each type. Okay, so you have to think of, how do I get from the path over to the element? Because a lot of times it's just grass and then maybe some engineered wood fiber around that little piece of equipment, to stretch or do something. There are some really great companies now that are providing outside exercise fitness equipment that is universal. You can do it from the seated position on one side, or you have a little bench on the other side. So there's a lot of equipment out there now that really facilitates strength and cardiovascular training for persons unable to use their lower extremities. And so I encourage you to think about the inclusiveness. Now, if you're talking about exercise equipment and it's going to be indoor, how do we facilitate access to persons that can't see or hear? Because so many times it's a touch screen, right? It may have bells or whistles. So think about the communication features when you're providing exercise equipment at the rec center, and how are we facilitating the best access, independent access, for the widest range of users?
Okay. What requirements and elements should one look at when evaluating a nature playground design for accessibility?
First thing, access to it, right? We've got to have an accessible route from site arrival. And if there's bus stops around your park, it would be from each transportation stop, okay? Or your accessible parking space. So the first thing to do is understand what your slopes are and how easy it is to get to the site. Where is this play area, right? How am I going to get to it? And it may mean that you need to move the accessible parking or side arrival closer. You know, I mean, we see that a lot of times done with fishing piers and platforms and stuff like that, where you have to go down a hill. And so what they do is provide accessible parking way down by the pier, right? So their accessible route's only down over there. They don't have to come from the top of the hill. Some of that needs to be, looked at when you're talking here is how do I get there? That's the most important thing. That's the first evaluation, right? I got to make sure people can get to it. And so there's not a railroad tie bordering the engineered wood fiber around the outside edge. If there is, it's cut open or there's a ramp up and landing, right? And then another ramp down into it. How do people facilitate that access to? Once they get to it, then you're looking at the type of surface material that's in there. Is it going to be accessible? Is it an engineered wood fiber that they're actually just using mulch? They, shredded a whole bunch of limbs because it came down. Or are they actually doing engineered wood fiber? Are they just throwing it in the hole and expecting the kids to tamp it down? Or are they actually vibra tamping it, wetting it, compacting it, installing it per the manufacturer's instructions to make it accessible? And then you're evaluating, where's my ground level? Where's my elevated? Hopefully, if you're looking to buy a new play area, your company, in Minnesota, you've got a great one, Landscape Structures in Delano. I've been to their manufacturing site, really good company. They may be able to help you understand which ones they've identified as ground level and elevated so that right then you can trigger and understand where my accessible routes are. But that's really the key. Get people to it first.
Good point. What's the difference between inclusive versus accessible?
Yeah, that's a good one always, right? Okay, so I always think it's like you can get to the dance floor, but inclusive, they've asked you to dance. You're in there. Okay, you got the whole action going. So that's the idea, right? Accessible is what we just talked about. Did we meet those accessibility requirements to get there? Inclusion is that dispersion. Did we make it so everybody can run the whole place? Can people that can't see, hear, or walk, or maybe are on the autism spectrum or have a developmental disability, can everybody participate if you're young or old? That's really what inclusion is, right? We're ensuring the access beyond like the ideas of universal design, right? Incorporating greater access. Accessibility is just getting it to it, okay? Inclusion and is just what we're after, right? It's really what we don't want to just meet the minimum of accessibility. We want to go beyond that. We want to make sure that everybody can have fun and participate. I think everybody's got to play every day. I try to do it. So I think that it's really important to all ages. I do some contract work for a company that does a lot of playground equipment, and they've installed them in college campuses and at retirement facilities, and it's amazing how many people just want to swing. I mean, you put a series of swings outside a college dorm, they're busy all the time. So I just think that there's a lack of play for people of all ages, and I don't think the play area should be designed just for 5 to 12-year-olds. I think we got to do 12 to 90-year-olds.
Good point. The next one is about surfacing. Is decomposed granite still an ADA approved surfacing material?
Well, nothing's approved, right? I mean, there's no stamp of seal. You get the good housekeeping stamp of approval. You could have a decomposed granite that's 2 inches each piece. That's not going to be accessible. The idea here is 3/4 inch minus. 3/4 inches is the largest stone all the way to small stone to stone dust, so that it compacts and knits very well. But even with decomposed granite, you would have to compact it, I would think, to make sure that it's got the levelness and the stability and firmness you need. If you can't push a grocery cart through it or an umbrella stroller with your little kid in it, you got to turn around and drag it. You're leaving a track in it. It's not firm and stable. Okay, so you're going to have to compact the crap out of it, I think. I think it can be done. I mean, I've seen it, a lot of that decomposed granite or limestone, whatever you can get quarried near you. Just make sure that it's not a very large stone, that it's a series of sizes. It's not like a pea gravel where it's all rounded and won't kind of intermesh, and that you compact it. You even maybe use a stone dust or even some type of stabilizer and topically spray on it, but that you keep it hard packed. That's the real key.
I don't see any more questions here. Does anyone else have anything they want to? Oh, here we go. other disabilities, hearing, visual, sensory, meet inclusiveness versus mobility in equipment?
That's tough, isn't it? I mean, how do we make sure? I would think communication panels is one. Okay, give people tactily and visually a way to communicate with some communication panels is one way, I think, for persons that are nonverbal. And for a lot of people to engage socially, how's my day, being able to type out things, that type of thing. Visually, I think, I honestly think an explanation of the play area. And I think, tactile models are so much cheaper to make now that we can 3D print. And so maybe there's an idea where you put some, well, let me just say I've worked a lot with the National Park Service and other federal agencies to where, tactile models are huge. And being able to show the site layout in relationship to other things, or the sizes of things could be very helpful in a play area so somebody doesn't run in front, cross in front of the swings, something like that, or get involved in an area where they shouldn't be going to. But just that tactile experience of being able to understand where the slide is, where the composite play structure is, what's there. For somebody with that's low vision or blind, that can be really intimidating, right? And very challenging to know what you can do. And it's probably going to take someone they trust very closely to help them through the first process of understanding where things are and how things work, right? And so after that, I think there's more independence and freedom once they have a familiarity of where things are located. That's always an easier thing to do. So I think anything that you can provide ahead of time or any type of a tactile model, any type of communication feature you can provide. Um, Sometimes wayfinding can be done in the surface material. You could use different colors to kind of wayfind through that, or even different surface materials themselves could be helpful. Maybe by grouping certain things in certain areas could also help. I think, I did a webinar and all we did is talk about the issues of elopement for people on the autism spectrum and how dangerous can be to have like a real hazard near a play area. So that's something to always consider, whether it's landscaping or fencing. If you have a busy street or a pond or a lake near the play area, how do we make sure that everybody stays safe and that you can keep track of everybody? So I think sensory as well. There might be some play component kits. There's some sensory kits that are in school play areas a lot of time that incorporate some opportunities to, again, understand the play area better, understand the different motions that are occurred, and different ways to play, whether it be at a play table, a water table, a sand table, to where everybody could participate together.
Where might we find guidance on properly compacting engineered wood fiber for an accessible play surface?
Yeah, so I would say if you've got engineered wood fiber, who's providing it to you? Who's your surface provider? There's a lot of them out there. I don't want to start naming them a bunch, but if you go engineered wood fiber and you can go to these websites that are selling this stuff, they need to have a maintenance instruction and an installation instruction for you to understand it. I've been part of many different what we call interlaboratory studies on engineered wood fiber, and I can tell you that it needs to be compacted while it's wet. And while it's wet, you compact the heck out of it. And then you go 2 inches at a time and keep going up to the level that you need. And typically it's going to be at least 12 inches of depth. But you need to bring it up level. Remember, you need to have it so that your entry point and seats is at the right level, that the discharge out of an accessible slides at the right level, that there's no changes in level from the hard surface into the play area. So there's a lot of different things to consider on that engineered wood fiber. But it can be a really challenging surface underneath swings, underneath the slide, in high traffic areas, or where there's a large population of kids using it on a daily basis, like at a school. I think honestly, the only way you can really maintain that is with a unitary surface or some type of turf. If you have that volume of people on it regularly. Let me just say that when my kids were young and um, we would try to find a play area where I knew I could catch them when it was time to go home or just interact with them all the time. And we would drive almost 30 miles to get to one that was made for a young lady by the name of Hadley. It was Hadley's Park. and she was a child with cerebral palsy that her parents had really raised the cash for to create this community park that had a unitary surface and ramp to everything. And it was such a great experience for me to be able to have that opportunity to interact with them, because all the ones around me had a railroad tie and engineered wood fiber, and I couldn't even get in there if they fell. And so people will search out, and I think it's so important that you really advertise and let people know if you have some play areas that do have a unitary surface or are more accessible than others, instead of them just trying to figure it out on their own. Or if a school play area is open during off hours that's in the community, because if not, I mean, I've run a lot of camps for kids with disabilities and mainly in chairs, but we'd always hunt for large parking lots, right? We'd be playing softball in parking lots, basketball on parking lots, or just interacting on parking lots because it was the surface that we could really interact with each other on and play games on. And so I think providing miracle fields, baseball fields or softball fields that have surface material that you can go all the way to the outfield and still be accessible on, making sure that the whole facility, those site amenities support the family for the day with a child or an adult with a disability as well. Concession stands to toilet rooms to parking to everything you provide, your drinking fountains, your pet stations, whatever it is, that you look at the whole inclusive experience so that people don't have to just run home because they have to go to the bathroom when they have a toilet room there. Remember, temporary facilities are still required to comply. If you have porta-johns and you only have one, it needs to be the wheelchair accessible one. Okay, you have to provide accessibility at every single toilet room unless they're a cluster of all the same. So look at all the amenities and site furnishings that support a family's opportunity to participate for more than just that one activity.
There aren't any more mess or questions here, but I do have one. So when you look at a nature play area, what's the most common mistake you see that is made by people with really good intentions building these naturescape playgrounds? What's the biggest stumbling block that happens that we should look for to avoid?
Well, I just think they're not very inclusive, right? I mean, it's all climbing. Typically, it's all climbing. It's a fallen tree, it's rocks, it's things like that. So climbing's a real challenging issue for persons with mobility impairments, right? So we've separated that right now. And the hard surfaces that are in nature play areas are a lot of surfaces that could be rough or jagged, or skin integrity could be a real issue, even if you're scooting or trying to slide on it. So I think it's the lack of opportunity that I struggle with the most. And then it's typically a natural surface. It's going to be engineered wood fiber, right? Because they don't want to have anything unnatural. So it's going to be engineered wood fiber. And whether it's being maintained or not, it's just another real challenge. So how do we make things that I think are for socialization, for learning, for physical development that supports the most people? I don't think it can be the only thing that's there. That's what I struggle with. I mean, yeah, a fallen tree, a bunch of big rocks, stuff like that. Yeah, it's fun. But have we made it so grandpa gets up there? No. I mean, what can we do to make sure that it supports more activities than just climbing? And if it's climbing that we're going to support, can we do something to increase its availability to other people? That's what I struggle with. I think it needs to be more than just that. What are we learning? What are we gaining?
Well, we did change our guidelines at the commission a year ago to include, we used to just fund naturescape playgrounds, and actually we've gone back to more traditional as well, because we wanted to be more inclusive of everyone. And that's harder to do. So that, for all of you who may not be aware of that, who are on the call, that are thinking about grants for the future, that is something that we do now. It's more than just a naturescape playground.
I think there's ways to do naturescape that have some more traditional elements that are really themed towards nature, so that you can incorporate, I don't know if it's the brown or green colors or, more the nature type of features. But I think there can be a lot of learning with certain types of elements that can be created in nature play areas as well. to facilitate all of the things that we're hoping, socialization, learning, play, physical development, emotional development, safety, just all of it. I think that when I develop something like that, I would think I'd want to make sure that I'm including a wide variety of community input and see that if we're really meeting the needs of the people we're trying to serve with that money.
Anyone else have anything? All
Well, I
right.
can round it out
Okay.
if there's no more questions. And I have one more slide, and it's just another resource because I wanted you to make sure I'm very particular about this resource because I spent a lot of time providing the guidance that's there. And I'm thinking it's the only guidance you can really get for free, copy, and then you could sell it if you can do that. Um, I just think there's a lot of opportunity to learn more through the webinars that are on their site. They're archived, they're free. There's a series of self-paced webinars that you can get CEU credits for. There's research on play areas being done. There's the minimum requirements, the surface guides, the FAQs. There's a provisional index for play areas. Remember, the ADA National Network has a resource, a checklist for play areas. So get these resources if you're working in play areas. Don't let people sell you equipment or surfacing without everything you understand and know about it. Okay. Exceed the minimum requirements. Don't do a D. Okay. Do better than that. And advertise. Tell people the great stuff that you're doing. Let them know where these accessible features are so that families can spend the day and communities can incorporate that. Therapeutic rec folks, adaptive physical education folks, they're always so important to involve in some of this opportunities of when you're designing and creating these environments that you're hoping are for everybody in all ages. And that's the real thing, right? We want all ages, all abilities, all the time. We want to focus on making sure that when we spend money on something like this, that we've done the best we can to facilitate the opportunity for play for everyone. And I encourage you again to go beyond the minimums, but think about not only the 5 to 12-year-olds in your play areas, but think about how we're going to get grandpa out there doing something or grandma out there doing something that, whether it's interacting with their young ones or themselves getting some exercise. I think things like that outdoor fitness equipment should be at bus stops. Okay. I think it should be on college campuses where people are just, I like to call it incidental fitness, right? Your kid might be running the play area, but you've got time here to do, sit-ups or do something cardiovascular for a little while on your own. So I like to think about incidental fitness as part of anything you do. How can we set it up so that people have a win wherever they're at? And so I encourage you to look at that full park experience, even though you might be focused on the play area requirements. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you again in April and you joining us for the one we're going to talk about accessible trails, pedestrian trails, and shared use paths, and hopefully shared some light with you on when you're designing those type of features, again, how to incorporate the greatest level of access.
Thanks, Bill. It's really good to have you with us. We sure appreciate it. The first forum has been a huge learning experience, and I know that April's is going to be equally wonderful. So if you have ideas for those third and fourth quarter seminars, please let Joe or I know, or note it in your follow-up email you're going to get with the survey there, because we are happy to take suggestions. That's what we're here for, to provide the information most people are looking for. So thanks, Bill. It's just wonderful having you with us. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, everybody, for being here today.